On August 20th, 2026, a court in Shenzhen sentenced a 67-year-old man to life in prison. His name is Hui Ka Yan. He founded a company called Evergrande. At its peak, it was the most valuable real estate developer on Earth, and he was the richest man in China. The court convicted him of fraud, bribery, and hiding more than $300 billion of debt. It called his crime, in the court's own words, exceptionally large and particularly egregious. That's the headline. That's the part that made the news. Here's the part that didn't. While Hui Ka Yan was on trial, families across dozens of Chinese cities were still making monthly mortgage payments for apartments that don't exist, buildings that stopped mid-construction years ago, empty concrete shells with no windows, no plumbing, no roof. They paid the full price up front before a single brick was laid. And when the company collapsed, their money was already gone. He got life. They got the bill. This is how that happened. To understand what went wrong, you first need to understand what Evergrande actually sold, because it wasn't quite what you think. In most countries, you buy a house after it's built. You walk through it, you see the rooms, then you pay. In China, for the last 2 decades, that's not how it worked. Developers sold apartments off-plan, years before construction finished, sometimes before it even started. A buyer would put down the full price for a unit that existed only as a rendering, a scale model in a showroom, and a floor number on a brochure. This is called the pre-sale model, and it wasn't some shady loophole. It was the normal, government-approved way to buy a home in China. Buyers did it because pre-sale units were cheaper and because for 20 years, prices only went one direction, up. Here's the part that mattered most. When a family paid for their apartment, that money didn't sit in an account waiting to build their specific building. Evergrande used it. Some of it paid for their tower, yes, but a large share went somewhere else entirely, buying the next plot of land, starting the next tower, paying interest on the last one. Picture it as a row of buildings, each one funded partly by the deposits from the tower after it. Tower 1 gets built partly on the promises of Tower 2's buyers. Tower 2 gets built partly on Tower 3's. As long as new buyers kept arriving, as long as the row kept extending, every tower eventually got finished and nobody noticed how the money actually moved. It's a structure that only works in one direction: forward. It needs a constant stream of new buyers, new land, new debt, and rising prices forever. The moment that stream slows down, even briefly, the buildings at the back of the line stop. And in 2020, the stream didn't just slow down. Someone reached in and cut it off on purpose. Before he was a billionaire, Hui Ka Yan grew up poor in Henan province, raised largely by his grandmother. He finished high school, worked on a farm, worked as a security guard, and failed the college entrance exam on his first attempt. He passed it on his second try and studied metallurgy, the science of metal, on scholarships and stipends because his family couldn't afford to pay. His first real job was in a steel factory, working his way up to a management role over a decade. Steady, unremarkable. Nothing about it suggested what came next. In 1992, at 34 years old, he took 20,000 yuan, at the time less than $3,000, and moved to Shenzhen, a city being rebuilt from fishing villages into China's most explosive economic experiment. He wanted in on real estate. He founded Evergrande in 1996. And for the next 2 decades, he rode the single biggest urban migration in human history. Hundreds of millions of people were moving from the countryside into Chinese cities, and every single one of them needed somewhere to live. Evergrande didn't just build apartments. It built stadiums, theme parks, an electric car division, even a professional football club, one of the most valuable in Asia. At its height, the company employed 200,000 people, owned more than 1,300 developments in over 280 cities, and brought in over $110 billion a year in sales. In 2017, Forbes named Hui Ka Yan the richest man in China with a personal fortune of $42.5 billion. He built all of it essentially on other people's money, buyer deposits, and debt. And for 20 years, the Chinese government let it happen because a booming property sector meant a booming economy, and nobody in power wanted to be the one to stop the music. Then, in 2020, someone did. In August 2020, Chinese regulators introduced a policy that would later be nicknamed the 3 Red Lines. It set 3 simple financial tests for every major property developer. Your total debt couldn't exceed 70% of your assets. Your debt couldn't exceed your shareholders' equity. And you had to hold enough cash to cover your short-term debts. Cross even one of those lines, and regulators would cap how much new debt you were allowed to take on. Cross all 3, and you were essentially cut off. Evergrande crossed all 3. This wasn't an accident regulators discovered. It was the business model working exactly as designed, just measured for the first time with real scrutiny. Evergrande had grown by carrying enormous debt and by using off-the-books financing that didn't always show up clearly on its balance sheet. Chinese prosecutors would later say the company inflated its reported assets while concealing more than $300 billion of liabilities, deliberately making itself look far healthier on paper than it actually was. For years, that gap between the appearance and the reality didn't matter, because new money kept flowing in to cover it. New land deals, new pre-sale deposits, new bank loans, new bonds, all of it landing right on schedule to paper over the last round. The 3 Red Lines policy didn't create Evergrande's debt. It just switched off the tap that had been quietly refilling the gap for 2 decades. Without new borrowing, Evergrande couldn't finish paying for towers it had already started, and it couldn't start new ones to bring in the next round of buyer deposits it needed to keep the whole structure moving forward. The row of buildings, each one funded by the one behind it, had just lost its newest tower. And dominoes, once they stop being added to, start falling backward instead. By August 2021, construction had already stalled at Evergrande projects across the country. China's central bank summoned company executives directly and warned them publicly to get their debt under control. On September 23, 2021, the deadline arrived for an $83.5 million interest payment to foreign bondholders. Evergrande missed it. It had a 30-day grace period, and it scrambled. In October, it missed a second round of payments, $148 million this time, then paid part of what it owed just before a make-or-break weekend deadline, buying itself a little more time. By November, its stock had fallen to an all-time low. The company that once sold more real estate than almost anyone on Earth was now widely expected to become China's biggest ever corporate default. This wasn't just Evergrande's problem anymore. Dozens of other Chinese developers had built their businesses the exact same way. Pre-sales, heavy debt, constant expansion. As Evergrande wobbled, lenders and buyers everywhere started asking the same question about every other developer. Is your money actually there? Or is it also just a promise waiting on the next tower's deposits? Trains across the country slowed down or stopped entirely. Some developers managed to work through their debt. Evergrande did not. And somewhere in the middle of all of it were the buildings themselves, hundreds of them, half-finished, going quiet. No cement trucks, no workers, just steel skeletons standing in the weather, waiting for money that wasn't coming. The families who'd already paid for apartments inside those buildings were still, every single month, sending their mortgage payment to the bank. The tower had stopped. The bill had not. For a while, they kept paying anyway. Then, in the summer of 2022, they stopped. It started with one group of buyers in a city called Beijing, who'd purchased apartments in an unfinished Evergrande project. Construction had already blown past its deadline. The building wasn't close to done, and they were still paying full mortgage installments on it every month. So they organized and they announced they were done paying until the building was finished. The idea spread online faster than anyone expected. Within weeks, buyers at other stalled projects from other developers in other cities were doing the same thing. Within a couple of months, it had reached more than 300 unfinished projects in over 90 cities across China. About 1 in 3 of those projects belonged to Evergrande. The scale of what was actually at stake became public around the same time. Roughly 1.5 trillion yuan, about $220 billion, in mortgage loans were tied to homes that were still not built. $220 billion, borrowed by families, owed to banks, for apartments that, in many cases, still don't exist. Chinese banking regulators stepped in and pushed lenders to extend more financing to stalled developers trying to get construction moving again before the boycott spread further and put the banking system itself at risk. But you have to sit with what actually happened here for a second. These weren't people speculating on real estate. These were families buying the one home they were ever going to own, in many cases their entire life savings converted into a deposit on a promise. They did everything they were supposed to do. They saved. They qualified for a mortgage. They signed the paperwork the government had approved. And the apartment on the other end of that transaction simply never arrived. Hui Ka Yan was formally arrested, and in April 2026, he pleaded guilty to a set of charges that read like a checklist of how the whole scheme actually worked: illegally taking public deposits, fundraising fraud, misusing funds, illegally extending loans, fraudulently issuing securities, and bribery. On August 20th, 2026, the Shenzhen Intermediate People's Court handed down its verdict: life in prison. He was also stripped of his political rights for life and ordered to forfeit his personal assets. His sons and a group of senior Evergrande executives were sentenced alongside him, some to as many as 18 years. The companies themselves were fined more than $2 billion combined. The court's own language was blunt. The amount involved was, in its words, exceptionally large, the circumstances particularly egregious, and the economic losses extraordinarily heavy. Reading the verdict, it's tempting to feel like the story is over. The man at the top was punished, the company was fined, justice on paper was done, but a life sentence doesn't rebuild a single tower. A $2 billion fine doesn't refund a single family's deposit. Somewhere tonight, there is still a couple lying awake doing math on a mortgage for an apartment they have never once stepped inside, because the building it belongs to is still just a concrete frame open to the sky. The system that let this happen, pre-sale deposits funneled forward, tower funding tower, wasn't just Hui Ka Yan's invention. It was standard practice, approved and encouraged for 2 decades across an entire industry. He is one man. This was one company, and it was still large enough to leave $220 billion of unfinished promises behind it. Here's what's easy to miss in a story built around one man's downfall. Hui Ka Yan didn't build Evergrande alone, and he isn't the one still making a mortgage payment tonight on an apartment that doesn't exist. Every deposit, every pre-sale contract, every tower funded by the tower behind it that required millions of ordinary people to trust a system that had never let them down before. For 20 years, it never did. Prices went up. Buildings got finished. The music never stopped. Until, deliberately, it did. And when it did, the people holding the bill weren't executives or shareholders. They were families who had done everything right and were left holding a stack of monthly payments for a home that was never delivered. He got life. They got the bill. That's not a clean ending. It's not supposed to be. The verdict closes a court case. It doesn't finish a single building, and it doesn't answer the question that actually matters going forward. What happens to a system built on paying for things before they exist? Once the one thing it always required, that tomorrow keeps arriving on schedule, stops being guaranteed. Evergrande is one company. The pre-sale model it exploited is still, today, how most homes in China get built and sold. Somewhere out there, right now, another tower is rising, funded in part by the deposits from the tower going up after it.